right before we were about to publish, we got a letter from a law firm, like one of the biggest law firms in the U.S., saying that they were going to sue us out of existence if we publish the story. And so, I wrote back to them. I thanked them for their message, and I explained that we had all the best science, so they didn't have libel or slander. But anyway, so I said, thank you, but we're publishing the story. And so we went ahead and published the story, and it immediately got a lot of attention. So other outlets did stories. It got, environmental groups started to do campaigns around it. The Peruvian government launched an investigation. Local communities were protesting. So all this stuff kind of came together. And then 2 years later, the company was delisted from London Stock Exchange. And so the reason that was important was that it had been planning to have an offering to raise money to clear more forest. So they were planning to clear up to 100,000 hectares for oil palm plantations and cacao plantations. And so, the net result of that deforestation not occurring was about 30 million tons of CO2 emissions being avoided. And so, Mongabay played a role in that. We weren't the reason for it, but we contributed to this outcome. And so that's kind of my favorite story.
Welcome back to another episode of the Protect the World podcast. Every month, I connect with a different not-for-profit organisation that's making the world a better place. My goal is to learn about the issues they're tackling, interview the founder or director, and then share their stories with you. But I don't just want to share their stories. I want to contribute to their work as well. If you'd like to help me, you can sign up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes. The voice you heard at the beginning of this podcast belongs to Rhett Butler, founder and CEO of Mongabay. Mongabay is a not-for-profit conservation news service that covers the intersection of people and nature. With bureaus in Latin America, India, Africa, Indonesia, and the US, plus a network of journalists from across the globe, Mongabay shares stories relating to tropical forests, oceans, wildlife, the conservation sector, and frontline communities. During this conversation, Rhett and I discuss bridging the gap between research and reporting, the benefits of a non-profit model in journalism, and how the failure to price in externalities is at the core of our environmental crisis. With their focus on solutions-based, impact-driven journalism, Mongabay is an organisation I've admired for quite some time, and I hope this conversation encourages you to follow and support their work if you don't already. So now I bring you Rhett Butler, founder and CEO of Mongabay. Rhett Butler, a very warm welcome to the Protect the World podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on. I'd like to start by asking, who are you and how do you describe yourself?
My name is Rhett Butler, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mongabay, which is a conservation news service. And I would describe myself as a journalist and publisher of news information that's at the intersection of people and nature in what I would call impact geographies, primarily the tropics.
Fantastic. It was interesting sort of reading your background in preparation for this because I really related to your spark, that sort of moment that got you into everything. Many years ago, I booked a spontaneous trip to Borneo and it was genuinely life-changing, like that first time in a tropical jungle. And I believe you've had a similar experience. So I wanted to ask, what is it for you about nature, but about rainforests more specifically, that's so special and inspiring?
So I think there would probably be two things that are special for me in the rainforest, like two big things. So one is just the diversity of life. So there's just so much there. And you can walk up to a tree and sort of stare at it and you'll notice all these things that are happening, which can be just really incredible. You have, a camouflaged wildlife, you have plants growing off of trees, just so much to see. And I guess the other thing is sort of like the serendipity where every walk in the rainforest is different and you never know exactly what you're going to get. So I really appreciate that.
That's really interesting. Do you remember that first time that you walked in a tropical jungle?
Yeah, so I was always interested in tropical forests because of the diversity of herps. So when I was a kid, I was really into frogs and lizards specifically. And I had the great fortune of being able to travel when I was a kid because my mom was a travel agent. And so I went to some tropical, not true tropical forest, but like Hawaii. I mean, I live in California, so it was easy to go to like Hawaii, and just had I love sort of the humidity and the smell and all the things that were happening around me. But again, that's not. It's a different kind of forest. I mean, it's a tropical forest, but it's not the Amazon. So the first time where I kind of had that real tropical forest experience was in the Ecuadorian Amazon near Yasuni. And so that's like, lowland rainforest, one of those biodiverse places in the Amazon, and just that overwhelming richness of life all around you. And even before you set foot in the forest, you see like leafcutter ants and butterflies flitting through the clearing on the edge of the forest. And you walk into the forest and it's this green cathedral. Uh, it's just so amazing. So I think that's probably that would be the first time where I fully got that experience of like a primary tropical forest.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, Now, the reason that you're on the podcast is because you're the founder and CEO of Mongabay. And firstly, a big congratulations on 25 years this year. That's incredible. I want to get into that history, but first, just give us the elevator pitch. What is Mongabay and how does it differ from mainstream journalism?
So Mongabay is a news service that covers issues at the intersection of people and nature. As I just just repeating what I said before, but via a global network of local reporters, and so that's important because we have people. We have either staff or contributors in about 80 countries, and so we have frontline journalists who are contributing to our reporting. Um, so what is like intersection of people and nature mean? So those are issues like tropical forests, oceans, wildlife, the conservation sector, but then also frontline communities, especially indigenous communities. And so those are our core beats. I think what makes us different from sort of mainstream media outlets is just our focus on this topic. So mainstream media outlets can do great stories on these things, but they tend to be few and far between. And so we're just fully dedicated on these issues. And then the international component is, kind of sets us apart a bit. And then also we publish in multiple languages. So it's not just English. We, are doing Spanish, Indonesian, Hindi, Brazilian, Portuguese, and French. And so we have significant reach in the key geographies that we're covering.
Brilliant. And could you talk a little bit about Mongabay's funding model? I mean, you don't rely on, say, advertising like some other journalistic organizations might.
Yeah, so Mongabay began as a for-profit based off advertising. And so with a for-profit model, you're basically monetizing your traffic via advertising or a paywall subscription model. So Mongabay has evolved into a nonprofit. Um, so basically, that transition was complete by about 2015. Started in 2012. And so our resources come from donations and grants primarily. So earned income is less than 1% of our budget. And so what that means is that we are, constantly raising money from institutional foundations, from individuals who range from, like giving us a dollar once to people who have greater resources who, may give us thousands of dollars. And so, one of the fundamental differences, or I guess that makes a big difference in how we conduct operations or how we think about what we do. So when you have a for-profit that's based off of an ad model, you're really trying to maximize traffic. Whereas the nonprofit model, at least the way that we approach it, is we're trying to maximize impact. And so that leads to decisions like focusing on distribution platforms that may not reach the most people, but reach a very specific audience. And just an example of sort of how this manifests a few years ago is We had a lot of traffic coming from Facebook that was just very, when we analyzed the numbers, we could see it was just very low quality. And so we asked the question of, why are we investing efforts in Facebook if it's just driving, mostly trash traffic where people are not, they're just, looking at something and leaving. They're not, scrolling down or anything else. So we decided to flip a switch and basically say, okay, we're going to shift all our efforts from Facebook into other platforms that are driving higher quality engagement, meaning people spend more time on a page, they scroll farther, they click on more pages, things like that. So we made that decision. So we made that switch, and the next month our traffic dropped by 4 million visitors. But we were also tracking other metrics, including the total time people spend on Mongabay. So in aggregate, the amount of time people spent on Mongabay between those 2 months actually increased. So that traffic we lost from Facebook actually had no impact, right? Because it was just very superficial traffic. So we still got some traffic from Facebook, but it was higher quality traffic. But ultimately, but the overall amount of time people spend on Mongabay, which is like a very superficial proxy, I would say, for quality of engagement, increased. And so you would never make that decision as a for-profit because you're losing ad revenue. But for a nonprofit that's focused on impact, it made a lot of sense. And I gave a heads up to our donors and the team and our board and things like that ahead of time. So I warned them that there was going to be this shift, and not just sweat it because it was anticipated. And so it ended up working out for us. And then, a year later, I guess Facebook, launched this war against news. So, it's kind of we were lucky in terms of the timing, but, if we had kept investing in Facebook, it all would have gone away anyway in, 2022.
Isn't that incredible? Drop of 4 million people and the total amount of time didn't change. That's remarkable. You touched on it a little bit already there, but I guess so for the first 10 years, I believe that you were running Mongabay pretty much on your own. And now 15 years later, you've got over 100 staff, another 1,000 contributing journalists from all over the world. Tell me what changed.
So I started Mongabay with no particular ambition other than to raise awareness about tropical forests. So I created the website, but I had a real job. So I was, working in an office sort of thing. And Mongabay was on the side. And then Mongabay grew popular. And then in mid 2003, I put ads on the site. And then within 6 months, the revenue from advertising was equal to about half my take home pay. So I decided to quit my job, which is my passion. And so that's when I started doing Mongabay full time in 2004. And then a few years later, 2008, I guess, I hired my first staffer. So Jeremy Hantz, who still writes a lot for Mongabay and does editing. And so it's two of us. And so that was Mongabay. But I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no advertising-based business model for. So the primary thing that I wanted to do was launch an Indonesian language news service. And why Indonesia? Well, so Indonesia has incredible biodiversity and it has a lot of environmental issues, a lot of which are related to mismanagement and corruption in the natural resources sector. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of environmental journalism in Bahasa Indonesia or Indonesian that spanned Indonesia. So it was tended to be very localized. And so I thought, well, if there was better coverage in Indonesian, it could lead to positive outcomes and help sort of, move the needle because it could increase transparency and accountability. So I don't speak Indonesian, but I had done a lot of reporting in Indonesia. And so I thought, well, if I could find resources to hire great journalists in Indonesia, and provide them with those resources, they could do amazing things. I'm not the expert here; they're the experts. And so I decided to form the nonprofit in order to do that. And so I knew that when I formed the nonprofit, that I was going to have to dramatically shift what I did. So I was going to have to transition from being a journalist, doing what I loved, to being a manager and fundraiser. But that becoming a manager and fundraiser would enable me to hire journalists who are much more talented than me to do more reporting. And so for me, it wasn't, I didn't start this to become a manager, but I knew that the outcome would be better if I transitioned to that. I also didn't know whether I'd be good at it or anything else. And I had no connections to wealth or, background running a nonprofit. So I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to execute on this, but I was going to try. And so I applied for a grant, I got it, and then announced that in Indonesian and English that we were going to be doing this thing. And so a couple weeks later, after announcing a couple weeks later, I went over and interviewed the top 40 candidates who had applied because Mongabay was already pretty well known in Indonesia, at least in environmental circles, because we just did so much coverage in English in Indonesia. So I ended up hiring a team of 4. We launched a website about a month after the team joined. And then within a month of launching, it was the most popular Indonesian language news service. And then within about 3 months, we were getting referenced by like the president of Indonesia. So we got very quick uptake, and it was a place where we could learn a lot because Indonesia had like higher social media adoption in the US or like Europe, for example. So it's a place where you could test ideas and then bring those ideas back to the global Mongabay. And then eventually, over like a 3-year period, I transitioned Mongabay to the nonprofit. So basically, I donated all the news articles that we had created over the past decade plus or whatever to the nonprofit, and started building out the team as we raised more money. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's how Mongabay evolved.
Fascinating. And I guess, do you think there was anything particular about the Indonesian context at that time that made it such a perfect opportunity for expansion?
Well, I think there was a gap in the market. So there really wasn't an environmental news service in Indonesian that covered, went from Aceh to Papua. And so I think there was a desire for this kind of information. And so because this thing didn't really exist, there were a lot of talented people who wanted to be involved. And then there was also an audience that was hungry for this information. So I think those were sort of the key ingredients, and why it was success. But it was because the primary driver of the success was the people that we have on the team, which did the great work. So it wasn't me. It was the fact that we had these great Indonesian journalists and who were involved with the project.
Mm. And yeah, speaking about those people, you've got a number of different news bureaus across the world, and the most recent addition is an African bureau. Tell us about why you decided that was the next step for Mongabay and some of the key issues that you'd like to focus on the African continent.
Yeah, so Africa has been a gap for us for a long time, and we do coverage across the continent. But we didn't have a particularly strong network. I think we had like 40 or 50 contributors, and we had 5 or 6 staff, which relative to other parts of the tropics is small for us. And the problem is it's Africa relative to where the other geographies where we operate is very fragmented. So you have a bunch of countries that speak a variety of languages. The media environment is highly variable across borders. There are security issues. Infrastructure is tricky, and so it wasn't as high. It was hard for us to like do our work there. So it just became like a little bit of a lower priority relative to the other geographies where it'd be easier to sort of use Mongabay's model. That said, I mean, Africa is obviously very critical. So if we look at, it's like a biodiversity hotspot. If we look at trends like population growth or energy consumption or energy production, over the next 50 years, the highest amount of growth is going to happen in Africa. So Africa is critical for so many issues, whether it's biodiversity loss or addressing climate change, figuring out sustainable economies. And so it's very important. So that's, so once we were able to find the resources to actually move forward with this, we started to build it out. So that was this year. So it can take a very long time to sort of line up enough donors to get that critical mass to spin out a team from our global bureau into their own bureau. And so what that means is once you start a bureau, you basically have the infrastructure that positions that group of people for growth. So you have like a manager, you have a social media person, you have like a newsroom. And so you have to have enough of that to start a bureau. Within the African context, we're starting with 2 languages because we found that the majority of key decision makers in the countries that we're prioritizing tend to speak either English or French. We have ambitions and plans for going to other languages, but those you have to start somewhere, and so that's what we're starting with. And so, within Africa, West and Central Africa, which is primarily a francophone or French speaking, is one priority region. Then East Africa and Southern Africa are also areas there. Our capacity there is not quite as great as West and Central Africa right now, but the eventual goal would be to have 4 hubs in Africa: West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. And then Madagascar is kind of its own unique animal, but it falls. It's francophone, so it kind of falls within that lingually, within that initiative, even though geographically and culturally it's very different.
Mm. Yeah, I believe that's where the name Mongabay comes from, right?
Yeah, so Mongabay is derived from the name of an island off Madagascar. So it's in the northeast. It's covered with rainforest. For me, it's a very beautiful place.
Brilliant. I'm wondering if you could give a couple of examples of stories or investigations that Mongabay has produced that you're particularly proud of over the years.
Yeah, so my go-to for this, which a lot of people who know Mongabay have heard a million times, but is the story about this cacao company which was operating the Amazon, called United Cacao. And so back in 2014, this company had an IPO in London. They had this story where they were, reforesting the rainforest and working with indigenous people and all this other stuff. We weren't paying attention to any of that. We were using this platform, which was new at the time, called Global Forest Watch, which aggregates data from around the world on forests. And we saw these pink polygons popping up in the Amazon. So we started to dig into it. We knew a lot of researchers who had studied this area. And so there's great baseline data on what was there before. And so we quickly could see that this was very biodiverse forest that was being converted for these plantations. And so the company was misleading the public and investors about what it was actually doing. And there was a group called, which you're probably familiar with, Amazon Conservation Association, ACA, which was, doing analysis as well. And so we could rely on sort of their, what the history, all the history they'd captured, the carbon, all that. And then another institution, which was the Carnegie, well, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but so Greg Asner was a lead scientist there, and he had flown this area with an airplane and mapped it in high resolution. So, all the biodiversity and the carbon and everything. So we had that baseline, and so we went ahead, based off that, we had a reporter go and on the ground dig into it, and so we moved forward on the story. And then right before we were about to publish, we got a letter from a law firm, like one of the biggest law firms in the U.S., saying that they were going to sue us out of existence if we publish a story. And so, I wrote back to them. I thanked them for their message, and I explained that we had all the best science, so they didn't have libel or slander. Also, I pointed out that representing this company undermined their CSR policy and also their free speech commitment that they had on their website. But anyway, so I said, thank you for publishing the story. And so we went ahead and published the story, and it immediately got a lot of attention. So other outlets did stories. It got, environmental groups started to do campaigns around it. The Peruvian government launched an investigation. Local communities were protesting. So all this stuff kind of came together. And then 2 years later, the company was delisted from London Stock Exchange. And so the reason that was important was it had been planning to have an offering to raise money to clear more forest. So they were planning to clear up to 100,000 hectares for oil palm plantations and cacao plantations. And so, the net result of that deforestation not occurring was about 30 million tons of CO2 emissions being avoided. And so, Mongabay played a role in that. We weren't the reason for it, but we contributed to this outcome that involved a wide range of different actors. And so that's kind of my favorite story. There are a lot of other ones. So maybe if I want to move away from forests, just to be a little broader, we did an investigation a few years ago in Indonesia that was looking at labor abuse in this fishing fleet that was controlled by a Chinese company, and it's akin to slave labor. So there were people who would apply for an office job, and they would show up, and they'd basically be shanghaied and put on a boat, and their passports would be taken away, and then they'd be, forced to live at sea to fish, on an industrial fishing boat for years. So several died, a lot of very severe health problems. So the story was initially focused on this abuse issue, but through the process of doing that investigation, these deckhands were reporting that, we're actually catching a lot of sharks. So this tuna fishing is also a massive shark finning operation. And so that became a second story that resulted from that. And so we did this reporting, and it was interesting to see that the US Department of Treasury cited the exclusive data that we produced from this investigation to sanction the company. So the reason that was important was the company was eventually delisted, which again meant that it couldn't raise the funds, on public US markets to expand their fleet or their operations. So, and then there was a bunch of other stuff that happened as well, but that was sort of this like direct impact from this reporting, which I always love to see. You usually don't see it. Usually you have to sort of, do a bunch of forensic work and try to figure out like, okay, well, what is the correlation here? But that was a very clear link between the reporting and this outcome that happened in the world.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'd heard about the Peruvian example, but I actually remember reading that Indonesian story, and I didn't realize that it had come from Mongabay. So that's really cool. Tell us a little bit about the Mongabay Data Studio and Mongabay Kids. What are you trying to achieve with those two branches of the organization?
Yeah, so why don't I start with kids, because it's a little bit smaller. So when I started doing Mongabay full time, one of the first things I did was create a section for children about tropical forests. And I had that translated by native speakers in about 40 languages. And so the sort of the raising awareness among kids has always been a priority for Mongabay. It's been there since the beginning, essentially. But it's never been something that we've been able to scale up very much. And then 2 or 3 years ago, we had 2 people join to build out kids more. And so that's creating lesson plans and other materials for different age groups, typically like in the 3rd grade through 8th grade range. So that's kids. It's very hard to find funding for kids. I would say almost impossible for us. And so it's not as well resourced as we'd like it to be. The other thing is kind of the opposite of the spectrum. It's Mongabay Data Studio, which we announced this year. And so Data Studio has kind of multiple objectives, but I guess taking a step back. So at its heart, Data Studio is a data journalism initiative, and it's cross-cutting across all of our bureaus and all the topics that we do. So it's kind of like this layer within Mongabay is how it functions. And so there's 3 areas that Data Studio is focused on. So one is getting more stories out of primary data sources. So for example, like satellite data. So having the capacity internally to work with data scientists who are at a company like Planet or like at NASA or the European Space Agency to look at that satellite data and distill actionable information out of it that can go into stories. And so we do a lot with satellites now, kind of if we're looking out in the future, can envision, like bioacoustics being a source of data. So like you may have like an array of bioacoustic sensors from, Cornell Lab of Ornithology or something that are installed in, Peru or whatnot. And you start to see signals like the birds stop calling, like, migratory birds stop calling. And so you see that information happening, and sort of the scientific cycle may take several years to sort of, get that story out. You could have journalists working with scientists to cover the issue before it even appears in the science. And so that's one of the pillars of Data Studio. Another is we have data that emerges out of our reporting that currently would now sit in like a spreadsheet or a database somewhere and doesn't really, after you do the reporting, like it just, nothing happens with it. So creating decision support tools that are public facing to help people use that data for whatever they need it for. And so an example of how this has manifest is a few years ago we were doing a project on reforestation and restoration. And what we found is that there's very little transparency in the sector. So where this was really born out of was there was like a philanthropist who wanted to put a lot of money into tree planting and reached out to me and said, what are good tree planting projects? And I realized I don't have any idea, and it's very hard to get that information because you see people like selling bracelets or whatever, or like having like a good marketing campaign or a nice website, but you actually know what they're doing or if they're doing anything. And so that led to this initiative where we started to try to document what was being disclosed publicly in these projects. So like, are they using native species? Are they working with indigenous communities? Do they disclose their polygon of where they're operating? Do they track the survival of trees? Things like that. And what's interesting from that process is that once project developers got wind that Mongabay was doing this, we saw disclosure increase, even though we didn't reach out to them because they didn't want to have a bunch of red X's in their dashboard for their project. So that project is, I think there's about 500 in there now, or in the reforestation app. Our goal would be to have a much larger number of projects, and it's been a little bit slow. But we're hoping by building out Data Studio, we'll have more resources to be able to put into that to really blow that out much bigger. And then the third pillar of Data Studio is more around upskilling or capacity building of the journalism sector generally for using data. So getting more environmental journalists using these data sources for their reporting. So it goes beyond Mongabay. And so those are kind of the three areas that are the focus of Data Studio.
Brilliant. Yeah, I really love that that sort of melding of research and journalism in particular. I think that's a really exciting sector. Tell me, how do you see Mongabay evolving into the future? What have you got your attention focused on going forward?
So last year, I think we published a 2030 strategic plan, which lays out our roadmap for the next several years. And so that provides some, public disclosure of kind of where we're headed and what we see as priorities. But, one of the key themes is expanding the topics and the geographies where we operate. And so Mongabay Africa is like the first manifestation of that. But where are places where Mongabay can have a high marginal impact because, there's a high degree of threat or to biodiversity or a high rate of change, or there's large scale restoration happening and journalism is possible. So that's kind of like one thematic area. Another thematic area that's geographic, but then also like topic. So looking more at some of the planetary boundaries that we haven't focused on that much previously. So for example, pollution and novel chemicals. Another area that we're, that's sort of part of this is thinking about how do we reach certain audiences. So these could be like very targeted audiences, like people who are making investing decisions. How do we make our information more useful to those people? So kind of like those verticals. But then also one of the places we're trying to expand is among frontline communities. And so that means going beyond the languages and formats we're currently focused on. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about this, but it's, some of it's as simple as going from, text content to audio content. So where we're in a place where we could distribute short audio messages via WhatsApp to reach communities. And others doing more radio in some geographies. So then let's see what else. Data Studio is another manifestation of sort of where we're headed. So being sort of that layer that connects certain audiences to the science. So that bridge. And so again, there's this huge proliferation of data, but not necessarily the capacity to analyze that data or turn it into actual information. And so that's a key role that that journalism have in society is doing that exactly. And so the data studio is an effort to try to do that. And then sort of the last pillar I would say that's a key priority is goes really beyond Mongabay, which is more about sort of like the network or the environmental journalism space. So this is an area where the economics are really tough. It's like any journalism, like the journalism sector as a whole, there's been this massive transition where people are losing jobs and there's not the opportunities there used to be. And one of the knock-on effects of that is there are fewer opportunities for training or to get paid for writing. And so, Mongabay has a role in this is that we can provide some training, we can provide paying work for people, especially in places where there's not a lot of environmental journalism. And then also, more broadly helping inform the conversation, beyond Mongabay of, what is best practice or what are the things we need to be aware of. So things of that nature.
Fantastic. That all sounds really exciting. I'd like to shift focus to you as an individual now, if that's all right, Rhett. Tell me a little bit about the environment that you grew up in. Did you have a connection with nature from a pretty young age?
Yeah. So I was lucky. Well, in many respects, I was very fortunate. But in one way, my mother's a travel agent. As I mentioned earlier, my father traveled a lot for business. And so we would take trips as a family. That was a priority for us, for my family growing up. And so we would go to places like Venezuela, which gave me exposure to different cultures and environments and ecosystems. So that was really important. But, we didn't travel all the time. We traveled a couple times a year. So closer to home, I live in an area the San Francisco Bay Area, where there are a lot of places where you can get out in nature. So we have redwoods, that are 15 minutes from our house, and there's like a local creek that's, like 10 minutes away. And I would go down the creek and I would, like look for tadpoles and fish and frogs and things like that. And so I had those firsthand experiences. And even our yard, like we had ants, and I would look at the ants, and I would look under pots and see salamanders. And I would notice, over the course of like a decade, that there was a shift in the population of the salamanders. Like we used to have red ones, and the red ones went away and they were replaced by other ones. I don't know why, it could just be rainfall or whatever, but it was, I would notice things like that. And so I did have that firsthand experience in nature, which was instrumental in sort of how my childhood evolved and my, my long-term fascination with wildlife.
That seems to be a key theme among people who do it into adulthood. They had that experience at a really young age and had the opportunity to experience it, which is great. Who would you say your key influences and role models were when you were younger? Was there an important teacher that inspired you, or a public figure you looked up to?
So the short answer is not that comes immediately to mind. I would read books, and there were authors whose work I appreciated. Especially as I got a little bit older. I think I was more driven by the animals as characters themselves and the ecosystems and sort of that, what I would just sort of observe firsthand. But then as I got older, I would read like E.O. Wilson and David Quammen, who I really appreciate as authors, who would, I guess, add important context to sort of what I observed. Like, I don't know, like as a kid, I wouldn't know why something was, but then I'd read the book. I'm like, oh, here's like the science behind it, or the broader, how this fits into like this bigger picture. But I didn't really have role models growing up. I like appreciated my grandfather, but not because of anything he did on the environment. Just like he was a very ethical and upstanding person, sort of thing. So it was more on that level rather than, being like a conservationist or something.
No, I like that. You're allowed to say that it was the animals, and I think E.O. Wilson was particularly good at that sort of big picture, situating them in the ecosystem. So yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to say I loved your interview with Jane Goodall for her 90th birthday recently, and I think you've got another conversation with her coming up soon. Tell me, how did you come to be friends with such an incredible conservationist?
So she reached out to me maybe 15 years ago. She was a fan of Mongabay.
This is when it was
And
still quite small.
yeah, I mean, it was two people at that time. It was before the nonprofit. And I got an email and she said, this is Jane Goodall, like the real Jane Goodall. You can't give this email to anybody, but I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate Mongabay and I'm coming to San Francisco. I don't know, it was like in October, in a couple months, and it'd be great to meet you in person. So that was before that's where it started. I mean, I'd always been a fan of Jane Goodall, but I never expected to meet her or interact with her. So, yeah, it's definitely a surprise.
How did it feel receiving that email? That's incredible.
Well, it felt really good. I mean, it's just like, oh, well, there's Jane Goodall is this very accomplished and um, famous scientist, and she knows Mongabay. She's reading Mongabay, and it's just great to know that we're reaching people like that. And I just had a lot of respect for her as a scientist and an environmental advocate. So, just it felt really good.
Yeah, yeah, she's a special one, that's for sure. Um, you're obviously someone who's quite a big picture sort of systems thinker when it comes to environmental and social issues. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the whole green growth versus degrowth debate. Do you think that effectively tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, even things like poverty, do you think that's compatible with continued economic growth in already wealthy countries?
I do think it is compatible. I mean, whether it's likely or we're going to go in that direction is, I mean, that's like a separate question. But I think fundamentally, you can have a system where there is growth that doesn't destroy the environment. But you have to redesign the system so that you are not extracting resources in the way that we're currently doing it. So more of a circular economy approach. Um, but again, whether that's realistic given the current structure of our economy and how incentives are, there's essentially very few incentives to sort of address the consequences of our growth currently. And so until we do that, people are going to keep polluting or, burning fossil fuels or extracting resources because no one has to pay for that. So we need accounting that accounts for that. And then also a system that, incentivizes people to move away from the business as usual model.
Just to sort of drill down on that a little more, I guess I'm interested in how you would frame a system that is, say, decoupled growth from both carbon emissions and, let's say, raw material consumption. Like, what does that economic system look like? Because that's sort of what I feel would need to happen if you're going to have economic growth in a system that isn't contributing to climate change and biodiversity loss. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, one of the critical things is just addressing externalities. And so, right now, when you produce something, it's just cheaper to throw away, like the raw materials. And so, like we go out, we mine more, more critical minerals, and we don't sort of like go and mine the dumps to get that stuff back out. And so it's just like, feeding more garbage. You're taking more raw materials out, and you're putting more garbage into the system. Pollution coming out because you don't have to pay taxes or fines on most of this pollution. So there's like no incentive structure to actually change the system. And so if you have like a fully circular economy, you can get growth in different ways that aren't based off extracting more resources. You move from, like just at a basic economy level, like moving from manufacturing to services. So I do think it is possible, but again, like we're talking about what's possible versus like what's realistic, and whether it's realistic, I don't. In our current system, I don't think it's currently. You have that because sort of the business usual interests are too strong or powerful to move us. Like we couldn't get a carbon tax. You can't get like nothing. 2009 we were supposed to have in Copenhagen supposed to be like a game changing moment for addressing carbon as an externality, and it didn't happen. And essentially, there's been almost no progress since then. So, wow, I mean, so that's kind of like the realism of like the world we're in right now. And so it's frustrating because I feel like we keep going through these cycles where it seems like progress is being made, and then you're like, oh well, no, actually, we just kind of gone backwards the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think there is progress being made, and it is extremely frustrating. But you got to still keep plugging away at it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly progress in some areas. I that was a little bit too broad, I guess, the way to phrase that, but yeah, I mean, it's frustrating just seeing like the climate, the climate stuff in terms of where we are now versus where we need to be.
And I guess I'll follow up with another sort of big picture question on that theme. So, obviously, there's lots of different models of conservation out there, and I imagine you would have been exposed to a lot of them. So, what does effective conservation look like for you?
Well, so I mean, I think effective conservation can mean different things in different contexts, but one of the important things is you're actually achieving conservation outcomes. Because a lot of what I see in the conservation space is decisions being made because that's how it's been done before. So it's like inertia, rather than focusing on like what's effective. It's like, well, this is how we've done it. This is how we've always done it, and we know how to measure this. And like anything else, we're not really going to pay that much attention to. So I feel like that's changing now, especially over the past like 10 to 15 years, as there's more and more, the data is more and more available, and it's sort of like you can't really ignore it anymore. And so I do feel like we're in the middle of sort of a transformation of the conservation sector towards a more effective approach. I think like in one of the core examples of this is around indigenous peoples and local communities and the role that they play in achieving conservation outcomes. And so, back in the 90s, it's community-based conservation, but it was often kind of like lip service. And a lot of the big conservation groups, it like wasn't a core part of what they did. And you still had like conservation refugees where people were getting kicked off the land and being made enemies of conservation. That model is a lot less acceptable today than it was, say, 15 years ago. And a lot of the big conservation groups have put local communities at the center of what they're doing. And even if that's like in some cases that's marketing or sort of lip service, at least there is marketing and lip service around this, and there's like more accountability than there was, a generation ago. So I think that that's really important. I think like one of the key things about why that's happening is on the data side. The science is the scientific base for showing that when indigenous communities and local people have like tenure rights, that the conservation outcomes are better. And so if you want to achieve conservation outcomes, providing resources and empowering these local communities to do what they've always done, it can be a very effective intervention.
That's a great response. What advice would you give to a young person who's interested in doing the kind of environmental journalism that Mongabay is known for? I'm sort of picturing someone maybe late high school, early university. What would you say to them?
Well, I think it's really important to understand the value of communications. So thinking about like audiences. So who needs to be reached? What kind of information do they need? And like, what would they do with that information in order to make a decision? And so that's true regardless of sort of like where you are, if you're in journalism or investment banking or, science or, whatever. It's a very core basic principle that, informs sort of how you have impact in the world. So one is thinking about audience and communication generally. Another is just to do a lot of writing. So writing and reading. Because you become a better, writer the more you read. And so, just get out and start writing. Like you're not getting paid for it initially, but just go out and practice writing and think about how to frame things and how do you engage an audience. So those are really important. If we step back a little more broadly and talk about conservation sort of generally, conservation needs people of all different disciplines, background, and expertise. And so you don't have to be a conservation biologist to go into conservation. Basically, almost any skills will can translate to some role in the conservation space. And so, don't feel the need to sort of like limit yourself and pursue a certain path if you want to work in conservation, because there's lots of ways to end up having an impact on helping protect the nature.
That's really good advice. You recently wrote a really beautiful letter to your 3-year-old daughter about the fate of the Sumatran rhino, and you called it a letter that you hope you never have to send. And we'll put a link to it in the show notes for people who want to have a read. But I wanted to ask whether having kids has changed your perspective on the work you do in any way. Do you look at the world any differently? And I realize that's a bit of a personal question, so feel free to skip it if you want to.
No, I actually don't think it has changed it, because I've sort of had the same mentality beforehand. I mean, I've always thought this way, because I've always just believed in having respect for people and other species and ecosystems to sustain us. And so, I think having kids just cements it more, but it didn't like change my viewpoint, because I sort of had the same, I just had the outlook on the world, before that. So I know it's probably not a normal answer, but I was already sort of kind of in this headspace before. And so having kids didn't really change that equation. I mean, what the main thing that has done is it makes me more adverse to travel. So I had been, trying to reduce my travel before having kids, just because of the environmental footprint. But having kids means that, gives me even more incentive to try to stay around the house as much as possible. And I guess I'm having mixed success with that, but, still do have to travel a bit.
That's interesting, because you mentioned travel being such an important part of your childhood growing up. Are you planning on bringing your kids along on trips eventually?
Yeah, I'd like to give them opportunities to travel, but I live in California and there's a lot to see here. That said, I do want to take them to some of the places that have inspired me, but I also do think about, our sort of our environmental footprint. So there are other ways to experience these places without necessarily visiting them. But we take them quite a bit here in California to, some of the incredible nature we have. We haven't done an international trip yet, but my kids are small. So my daughter just turned 3 and my son is 6. So, but I would envision that we will take them some places in the not too distant future.
Very good. I want to ask you about your toughest, most challenging day or experience working for Mongabay. And I also want to ask you about your best, most rewarding day or experience. And I'll let you decide which you'd like to speak about first.
Toughest day. This is a tricky question. I have to think, because there's not like one day that necessarily stands out, but there's just some times where it just gets really hard. There's just so much that needs to be done. And sometimes you just have so many things kind of blowing up in your face at the same time. And you just have to get through it. So that's just, I know it's not a very exciting answer, but that's the reality of it. It's just, it's a grind. It's a constant grind. And, sometimes it's the grind wears more on you than other times. But I have trouble just thinking of like one moment that was like the worst. I definitely had bad days, but so I know it's not a very interesting answer. The best day. I really like it when we have tangible impacts from our reporting. So like when the United Cacao, when they got delisted, I was like, wow, this is truly amazing. And there's been a lot of stories like that. Typically they kind of play out over time, because you hear that, oh, this may happen, and then when it does happen, it's almost like, well, I already sort of priced in my head that it was going to happen. So it's not quite the same as like a surprise, but Mongabay's gotten some awards. I mean, I think the awards are nice, but we don't do Mongabay for awards. So great to get an award, but that's for us. Like for me, it's like it's like a bonus, but it's not like super exciting or like a life changing moment. It's just like, okay, well, we got acknowledged for something that we're doing, and that's nice. But the bigger thing for me is when I actually see like an outcome in the world that we've contributed to, and that's very exciting for me.
Great. We're almost done, but I have a couple of quick fire questions that I like to ask everyone. You keen for that?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Question 1. You're allowed to pick one person, living or dead, and you get to live their entire life from start to finish. So you pause your life right now, live their whole life, experiencing everything they've experienced, and then you come back to your life with all of their memories. Who do you choose?
So I think I would choose one of the first humans to set foot in either Australia or Madagascar, just to see what was there. I mean, it probably would have been very scary, but just seeing that megafauna, which was ecologically naive, had never encountered humans before. I think that would be just truly amazing. So I guess if I had to choose between those, it would be tough, but I am very partial to Madagascar, so I think I'd go with Madagascar.
That's a good answer. I like that. You wake up tomorrow to find you've been elected president of the world. You've got full power. Everyone's supportive of what you're doing. You don't need to compromise to win votes or anything like that. What's the first thing you do?
Well, I think I'd try to figure out a way to price in externalities. So maybe starting with like a global carbon tax is sort of like the easiest intervention. Because I think without pricing in externalities, like we're not going to be able to fix a lot of the problems that we have. So that's like the simplest way to address those problems.
And a couple more questions. So firstly, what are some other organizations that inspire you and whose work you admire?
So there's a group called Health and Harmony that I think has a really nice model for working with communities to protect a variety of ecosystems now around the world, but they started in Indonesia, specifically in Borneo. And so essentially like healthcare I guess is what you call the intervention. But what they do is the founder of that analyzed like what drives people to do illegal logging. It turned out like healthcare was the thing because people would have to come up with a bunch of cash really quickly. And the easiest way to do that was just to go chop down some trees. And so what they did is they created basically like a healthcare system that people would have access to high quality healthcare, and they could get it subsidized if the community agreed to not do illegal logging. And then one of the byproducts of this was if people didn't have money to pay for healthcare, they would get training in organic farming or other things. And so it turned out that when people got training in organic farming, their incomes went up dramatically because because the previous model was so dependent on chemical inputs. They were producing very low quality commodities that didn't have a lot of value. But once they switched to organic farming, not only did it reduce sort of like the pesticides and things like that, but they could grow more valuable vegetables, which would bring them more income. So it was like an example of a win-win. So that's a group that I respect a lot. I think Blue Ventures is another great one. So they work with local communities, started in Madagascar, now they're in other places, including Indonesia, which basically, they do periodic, fisheries closures that are, community led, and it's helped, bring back fish stocks while also bringing outcomes for these local communities and livelihoods, things like that. So those would be two. I mean, like in the scientific realm, I think Amazon Conservation, which I mentioned before, does really excellent work. I think like Nature Culture International is a really good NGO that works in Latin America. Rewild's doing really excellent work as well in traditional conservation. Sort of on the indigenous peoples front, Rights and Resource Initiative and Land Tenure Facility are doing really important work. Kind of in the think tank realm, I have a lot of respect for what World Resource Institute does, WRI. So they are the ones who organized Global Forest Watch initially. So that's kind of like a random hodgepodge of groups, but those are all ones that I have a lot of respect for.
That's great. We'll put links to all of them in the show notes so that people can check them out. And a final question for you. If people were to donate money to Mongabay, what sorts of things would that money go towards?
So if we get, so most of Mongabay's funding is restricted, so over 90%. And restricted means it goes to very specific projects or sometimes programs. So what we tend to do with unrestricted money is it goes into our rapid response fund, which we then just deploy for reporting on issues that we don't really have other dedicated resources for. So if fires like right now are breaking out in the Amazon, and we need to put more people, getting more people out to the field to do that reporting or more analysis of satellite data, we can just very quickly deploy more resources into doing that reporting. So Rapid Response Fund is kind of our vehicle for doing that. Beyond that, we would like to scale up Data Studio quite a bit. It's very nascent, and so like one of the problems we have with Data Studio right now is there's just so many people who want to partner with us, but we have no capacity to sort of expand right now. So our backlog of partnerships and projects is 2 years out, and so we need to expand the team so we can develop more of these relationships and more of these projects that we're getting approached with. So those would be the two probably areas I would call out first.
Fantastic. Well, the idea with this podcast is that every month I want to feature a different not-for-profit organisation, and then I also run a Patreon where people can support the project, and half the money that comes in helps me to keep sharing more stories, and then the other half goes directly to the organisations that are featured. So I'll be sending that donation over to Mongabay very shortly. A big thank you to all the amazing people who support the project, and an even bigger thank you to you, Rhett, for taking the time to chat with me. I've been a really big fan of Mongabay's work for quite some time, so I really enjoyed the chance to speak with you about it. So thank you.
Great. Well, it's very nice to meet you. Thank you for the opportunity.
That was Rhett Butler, founder and CEO of Mongabay. As always, I'd like to highlight 3 key points that Rhett made, and the first is this one.
So we made that switch, and the next month our traffic dropped by 4 million visitors. But we were also tracking other metrics, including the total time people spend on Mongabay. So in aggregate, the amount of time people spent on Mongabay between those 2 months actually increased. So that traffic we lost from Facebook actually had no impact, right? Because it was just very superficial traffic. So we still got some traffic from Facebook, but it was higher quality traffic. But ultimately, but the overall amount of time people spend on Mongabay, which is like a very superficial proxy, I would say, for quality of engagement, increased. And so you would never make that decision as a for-profit because you're losing ad revenue. But for a nonprofit that's focused on impact, it made a lot of sense.
To me, this was just such a perfect articulation of how the ad revenue model has broken traditional journalism. The fact that you can have a drop of 4 million visitors and still maintain an overall increase in engagement shows just how much this model is skewed towards benefiting advertisers over journalists, and why a non-profit approach that sees money as a means to an end, not an end in itself, is, in my opinion, how all good journalism should be structured. The next point I'd like to highlight is this.
So I ended up hiring a team of 4. We launched a website about a month after the team joined. And then within a month of launching, it was the most popular Indonesian language news service. And then within about 3 months, we were getting referenced by the president of Indonesia. So we got very quick uptake.
When I asked Rhett about his advice for young people, he emphasized the importance of knowing who to reach and how to reach them, and this was a great example of that. Starting from scratch in Indonesia with a team of 4 people, they were being read by the country's president within 3 months. There was tractability in a neglected space, and effective storytelling is as much about the context in which a story is told as it is the story itself. The final point I'd like to emphasize is this.
So the story was initially focused on this abuse issue, But through the process of doing that investigation, these deckhands were reporting that, we're actually catching a lot of sharks. So this tuna fishing is also a massive shark finning operation. And so that became a second story that resulted from that.
The key message that stands out to me with this story is the interconnectedness of so many issues of justice around the world. The human rights abuses of migrant workers on fishing boats were deeply intertwined with an illegal shark finning operation. And it points to the necessity of collaboration between labour and environmental movements. Too often they're pitted against each other, when in reality they usually have the same enemy. That is, an economic system that strives for profit above all else. If you'd like to support Mongabay, you can donate to them directly by visiting donate.mongabay.org, and you can also follow their reporting on all the usual social media platforms. On behalf of all the amazing people who support this project, I was able to make a donation of $160 to Mongabay. If you'd like to help me give more money to more amazing NGOs in the future, please consider signing up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes for as little as $5 a month. In the show notes, you'll also find further information about a range of topics that Rhett and I discussed during this conversation. Another big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast, and to Rhett Butler for being keen to chat with me about the incredible work of him and his team. I hope you found Mongabay as inspiring as I did. A quick note to say that in a few weeks I'll be heading back to Peru to produce some media for the brand new Boundless Fellowship Program, an initiative by the World Wildlife Fund. It was an opportunity that came up pretty recently and one I'm really excited about. However, it does mean that the Africa project has been pushed back slightly. The plan remains the same: 12 months, 12 countries, 12 NGOs, producing a short documentary about each. But it's looking like I'll now be heading over there in late November, with the first episode being released towards the end of December. In the meantime though, these podcasts will be continuing as usual. So I'll see you next month for another episode of Protect the World.